Chapter 1. Lasoni locked eyes with the other girl, wishing she could beat her face bloody. Unfortunately, that would have resulted in a broken hand. In Lasoni's world, a time and place before nations, machines, or hospitals, broken bones usually led to a slow, painful death. She hadn't always hated this other girl, Lasoni thought as she looked down at her reflection in the shallow, slow-moving water. She had fancied herself cute when she was younger, even amongst her own people, the Spears. But as all the other children grew beefier and broader, Lasoni gained height and retained her delicate bone structure. In the words of her clan leader, she was a skinny runt. Aside from the familiar facial structure of her tribe, she had thinner limbs, a smaller head, and more delicate fingers. As she couldn't imagine feeling any more unfit, Lasoni had been forced to interact with an entirely other species of odd humans. Unfortunately for her flagging self-image, they differed from the Spears, but only in the best of ways. Lasoni's people, Neanderthals, were shorter compared to the Longlegs, a tribe of Homo sapiens. And even as a child, Lasoni looked to be a mix of the two peoples. This made her tribe raise their collective eyebrows when they encountered the Longlegs for the first time. But as nosy and suspicious as her clan had been, it would have been unlikely for Lasoni's mother to have secretly mated with a Longleg. On the ancient plains of Anatolia, leaving the group's safety was unheard of. Eyes were everywhere, counting heads or taking them. Only the crazy or magical spent time away from a warm fire and the clan's pooled resources. To Lasoni, her selfhood wasn't a mystery, it was a curse. Not stout enough to be looked at as good breeding stock, yet not fine-featured enough to pass as a Longleg, she existed as a question mark. She analyzed her pale olive features with the moon hanging over her shoulder. Using 2 fingers, she traced a path across her brow ridge, down a pronounced cheekbone, and over her broad nose. As she pulled and pushed at her face with 2 cold hands, molding it into what could have been, a familiar and annoyingly shrill call permeated the silence. Lasoni, Lasoni girl. Her mother's voice cut through the dry, frigid air bouncing off the boulders and rock walls of the small valley. Lasoni glanced back towards camp, and her brow knit as she tried to ignore the call. Despite the cold and dangers lurking around, she didn't want to go back to the communal fires. She yearned to stay right here and somehow solve the riddle of why everything in the world seemed like it belonged except her. And it wasn't just her body she fretted over. She chattered too much, as her mother had put it, but so did anyone on the receiving end of Lasoni's relentless inquiries, come to think of it. And it seemed that her long list of unresolved questions grew with each new season. As a youngster, mingling with the Longlegs, Lasoni never seemed to have a place in their fun and games. She always ended up on the sidelines, watching as the extraordinary long-legged children defeated the Spear Kids in mock battles. She wanted adventure and escapism, not a reenactment of the early violence between the 2 tribes. Lasoni! A second call. Now Lasoni was bordering on trouble and punishment that would come with a third. With the angst only a trapped animal can know, she belly flopped the palm of her hand on the water, eradicating the ugliness she saw in her makeshift mirror. Shaking her stinging hand, Lasoni stood up and tried it on her tunic, scowling. Suddenly, it seemed her feet were wiser than she was. They moved Lasoni away from the soft water and back through the maze of scratchy underbrush and towards her mother's undoubtedly foul mood. But finding her way was the easy part. Ever since she could walk, she had an unusual ability to read her surroundings and never get lost for long. She was so good at it that once her mother had discovered her innate skills, she had ordered Lasoni to hide them from the tribe. As she begrudgingly headed back to their shelter, herded by the cold, Lasoni thought of that day from her youth. "Mama, look! Holding the basket over her head triumphantly, Lasoni smiled wide. Her mother ran over and smacked it out of her hands, sending the berries flying into dirt and dander. Lasoni was so shocked that her shaky young arms stayed up, the blood draining from her tiny face. This was not good. Her mother's hand cocked back again, but she stayed it, instead clenching it into a fist, then letting the arm fall to her side. Mama, No. No. Lasoni, what is important? What? Our clan and the spirit tribe, Lasoni repeated softly from hearing it hundreds of times, or was it thousands? Her mother stepped forward, anger turning into concern and love for her only child. She rubbed Lasoni's cold cheeks with her rough palms and kissed her dusty forehead. Lasoni's tiny arms encircled her mother's strong neck, and she was glad to not have been hit yet again. Pulling away, her mother regained her sternness. You were gone for a sun and a moon. How did you find us? That seemed like an odd question to Lasoni, and she actually had to think about the answer. She had often watched the trackers and hunters inspect the caves and prairies for signs of hyenas, saber-tooth, wolves, and of course the most dangerous enemy, other humans. However, between the hunters and trackers was a role reserved for those who could see beyond the physical signs of scat, claw marks, and muddy paw prints. Known as medicine keepers by most, they had many names and an equal number of abilities and duties. They were the spiritual glue that held the tribe together and kept the tenuous peace with long legs. The medicine keepers were an elite group within the many clans, composed of other oddities like Lasoni, and as she grew, Lasoni watched them too, primarily one in particular, and her name was Runine. Lasoni's clan leader realized that Runine could decipher things his best hunters couldn't. Eventually, she took up the healer's position when the former medicine man died. She emerged from her self-imposed hermitage, no longer shadowing the clan at a more comfortable distance. She walked right up to the burial pit and told the chief it was time, even as they threw dirt on the body of the Holy One. She was respected and accepted as his replacement on the spot, but slowly, over time, she reverted back to her solitary ways. She had lived feral for so long that being around others, with all their nonsense rules and stupid life choices, made her feel exposed and paranoid. When all the negativity started affecting her spiritual practice and power, she gave up trying to fit in. After that, she simply traveled parallel to the tribe as they migrated. Once again, she lived in a shadow realm between raw nature and human contact. Sometimes, she would come out of nowhere to join them, collect food, or spout off one of her esoteric monologues. She talked differently, often describing a bizarre twin world they just couldn't see. Even for a medicine woman, Runine was a gamble. But the chief had no other options, and she always seemed to materialize when needed most. Ever since Lasoni had first seen Runine, she seemed to understand her, or pretended to. Over time, Lasoni began imitating the strange woman, circling back to Runine's old campsites to see what she ate and how she lived. Once Runine caught on, she started leaving little dolls made of straw or clay, and that's when Lasoni knew Runine knew. In their silent communication, a relationship slowly emerged. One day, Runine felt it was time to test the great mystery again. Now she would gamble on this little spear girl, just like the clan had bet on her. For trust was as precious as food or fire amongst their kind, and none more so than the secrets shared and guarded by the medicine keepers. See this water? Runine said to a timid Lasoni as they squatted to scoop it from the river with cupped hands. Yes, Lasoni replied, wiping her mouth. You do this, Runine said, making a small dam of pebbles to trap and still the water. Now come. I will not hurt you like the others. How did she know? Had she seen the other small ones beating Lasoni when she wouldn't join their mock hunting parties? Did she see the occasional backhand from a drunken adult? Or... Come closer, Runine said again, excitedly. Behind them, the clan moved slowly, like an oblivious, domesticated line of oxen. Now, you see, what you see. Lasoni squinted at the water. There was the surface, bugs standing on the surface, little guppies coming up for said bugs. Below, green algae made the rocks very slippery. She remembered that after falling on her butt. Oh, here, Runine said, rummaging in her pouch and pressing something tough and lumpy into the little girl's palm. Bite soft, then suck, don't goo, Runine instructed cryptically, making a funny choke-then-die face. The instructions were not great, because Lasoni felt like even drinking was eating, wasn't it? And on top of possible poisoning, the strange leathery herb was not the dried meat Lasoni had expected when she eagerly began chewing. Blech. I know, Runine said, laughing at the herb's grossness as it became a snotty sludge in Lasoni's mouth. And then it became not so bad. And then she saw something else. The rocks and water became brighter, as if the sun had just pushed all the slate-gray clouds out of its way, lighting everything up just for them. Refocusing, Lasoni saw the sky reflected on the surface of the water. Puffy, billowing clouds drifted above and behind her. A bright morning star winked beyond the clouds, and then something clicked inside of her. She was suddenly aware of the layers within, yet reflected by this most essential element. Water, yes, to drink, but also to see yourself, and yet, over your shoulder, see beyond the self, the fading moon, planets, and stars. Lasoni felt she couldn't contemplate any more layers, but then she remembered water was also home to fish, salamanders, and snails. And even though the water's surface acted as a stationary mirror, she had been told that all the streams and rivers eventually joined with the great ocean. But where did the great ocean end? Runine could see Lasoni adding to and expanding what she understood and perceived. Also, the confusion and fear such revelations might create in a young mind. Suddenly, the pressure of all these newly connected attributes of water collided and contrasted forcefully against Lasoni's memories of water before the herb. It had been just a second ago. Just a second. How? Lasoni begged as dazzled, rapturous tears welled up in her eyes. I don't know, Runine said as the dust from the clan drifted over them, forcing a shared cough. Lasoni looked back to the little water mirror and watched how the bark-brown dust clung as a film on the surface. Suddenly, her eyelids felt very heavy, and the ground beckoned to her. When she opened her eyes again, she lay sideways in the water, Runine peering down at her curiously. I slept? Lasoni asked, pushing off the muddy ground and rinsing herself as best she could. Ha! No, you went. The dream place, but without sleep, you see. But Lasoni did not see yet. She did feel a strange new sensation, however. Something exciting yet nervous and scary at the same time. Something she could not name, but definitely a link between her, that disgusting herb, and this strange, enigmatic woman. Here, you drink. You drink this, and tea will show you sparkling sky again, but no, nap. Lasoni took a cautious sip from the strange gourd bottle, her eyes watching Runine for any sign of, well, she wasn't sure what. But she felt very odd just now, so it could be anything, really. The tea was sweet, popping Lasoni's eyes open. She loved sweet, even though honey was rare and, in her opinion, not worth the stinging welts. Suddenly, she was walking next to Runine, following the cloud of dust down the road. But how was this so? She had walked past forgotten memories? She had lost time from remembering the sharpness of the bees to just now. Lasoni looked over her shoulder, comparing her new location to the last one she recognized. No, all the events in between were just gone, like the water through her fingers. The water. She brought a hand up, turning it repeatedly, looking for any indication she was dreaming after all. She gave it a smack with her other hand, and Runine exploded with glee. Ha! No dream, but dream place. I told you. Listen. But, the tea, my secret. Shh, she said, with stern eyes and fingers to her lips. But an instant later she was laughing, clutching her belly. And the combination of the herb and Runine's glee made Lasoni laugh as well. When their laughter had tapered off, Runine suddenly got serious, her face taking on a stoic cast. She seemed to be mulling something over, weighing options. But then her smile was back, and she gave Lasoni a soft whistle to make sure she was paying attention and that the rest of the clan wasn't. With another shh and a finger to her lips, Runine brushed her free hand over a scraggly, spindly plant that Lasoni had passed countless times. As the yellow, popcorn-looking flowers coated Lasoni's fingers thick with pollen, Runine stopped walking. Kneeling before Lasoni, she smiled widely and pushed Lasoni's loose hair over her ears. This shrub, twig, this twig tea, Runine stated, shaking the gourd. Twig our secret now, Lasoni, Runine said, running her yellow paintbrush index finger down the middle of Lasoni's nose, prompting a tiny sneeze. Laughing, Runine hugged the still confused Lasoni, then clapped her shoulders twice and stood up. As young as she was, with the help of the chewy herb and the twig, Lasoni could recognize the pensive and nervous look in Runine's eyes and mannerisms. Like a fawn catching the scent of a coyote, she was about to bolt. Go now, little one. But you and me, Runine said, squatting to be face to face with Lasoni again. We are two eggs in the same nest. Same nest! Lasoni smiled. She loved birds. Suddenly, however, her face soured with concern and conflicting emotions. Turning from Runine, she stared hard at the plume of dust, now around a curve on the trail. But what about them? Lasoni said, feeling like her spirit was being torn in half and loyalties divided. Them? Aha, psht! They're cows, goats, dogs at best, eh? But we, Runine said, taking off one of her black feathered talismans and tying it around Lasoni's neck, we are birds.